Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jennifer Welsh on implementing the responsibility to protect. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at CG, and every week it's our pleasure to welcome a guest into the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some hot topic on the international agenda. And today I'm very pleased to be welcoming Jennifer Welsh, who's a professor in international relations at the University of Oxford and a fellow at Somerville College as well, and welcome. Also, a practitioner of sorts. You've actually done work with the United Nations on the responsibility to protect, among other things. So you'll help us understand the principle and how it is or is not being applied. So for the benefit of the audience that may not know the deep backstory to what we sometimes call R2P, responsibility to protect, maybe you can say a little bit about where it came from and why it's there and what its main effect was intended to be.
Well, the principle really arose out of the failures of the international community to respond to very conscience-shocking situations like those we saw in Rwanda, Srebrenica, and more recently the kinds of events we see in Syria. And the idea that while sovereign states are a building block of the international system, we need to be able to act to support states to protect their populations, or indeed, if they cannot protect their populations, to find a way to do so through the international community. So actually Canada was very instrumental in the development of the principle. In 2001, there was a commission, the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which issued a report called The Responsibility to Protect. And that principle really helped to change the way we think about these kinds of crises and to focus the attention on those who need protecting. The principle from there was adopted by Kofi Annan in his plans for the 2005 World Summit of the United Nations, and there states unanimously endorsed two clauses which enshrine the responsibility to protect, which is really a political commitment of states to protect their populations from four acts: crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes.
Now, the responsibility in the first instance is the responsibility of the government of the state concerned.
The state holds the primary responsibility, and there the principle really just reminds states of the existing obligations they have under international law to protect their populations. There's a second pillar, which these articles lay out, which is the responsibility of the international community to assist states in fulfilling those responsibilities, and that's through consensual means, whether it be development assistance, human rights work, even peacekeeping. And then there is a third pillar that states that when states manifestly fail to protect their populations, the international community needs to, according to the precepts of the Charter, use diplomatic, humanitarian, and possibly military means to protect populations from these acts.
Now, Canada is not really a frontline state in these situations, so what accounts for Canada's forward role in this principle?
I think it had a lot to do with Canada's involvement in the human security agenda, and the idea that the security of states, while vital to international order, is only part of the story, and that we need to think about the security of human beings in a multidimensional way. And Canada also, at the time, was instrumental in focusing on the hard end of human security, the protection of populations from physical integrity violations. So I think it really grew out of that, and out of the passion and interest of then Foreign Minister Lloyd Axworthy, who was quite instrumental in helping to have the commission created. It was created through the act of Jean Chrétien, who was then Prime Minister, but Foreign Minister Axworthy had a very important role to play in that. And actually Canada as well was very instrumental in 2005 in the diplomacy around the endorsement of responsibility to protect at the United Nations. Alan Rock, who was our ambassador at the UN, played a very important role behind the scenes and in urging states to endorse the principle.
And what's the uptake been like? If you go around the world, which countries have been enthusiastic supporters, maybe on the activist end of things when it comes to R2P, and where do we see resistance, and why do we see resistance?
Well, there's sort of three segments, if you will. We can split the population of states into three segments. Those who have been champions of the principle, which are not only Western or European states. They also include certain states from Africa. Rwanda right now, for example, co-chairs the group of friends on the responsibility to protect within the United Nations. A number of African states actually have been supportive of the principle because its language is very similar to what is in the Constitutive Act of the African Union. Very similar clause about the need to protect populations from grave violations. You then have a number of states who have consistently expressed concerns about the principle's potential association with military intervention. States like Cuba, for example, Venezuela, have typically been very concerned about that possibility. They've been vocal. They were vocal in September of 2013 when responsibility to protect was debated at the UN. And then there's a group in the middle who I think are learning more and more about the wide agenda, the three-pillar approach, and are becoming, I think, more supportive of the principle as we begin to identify its preventive elements and its association with existing agendas around, for example, human rights or development. So I think that group is slowly increasing in terms of its commitment to the pro side, if you will. That as they learn, they begin to see more how the principle can be implemented. And part of that has been taking national measures to demonstrate the responsibility to protect, whether it be identifying a national focal point within government that will be responsible for atrocity prevention. We've seen a number of states, over 30 states now, who've appointed a national focal point.
For internal affairs or for regional affairs?
Both. So the national focal point is meant to essentially spearhead national risk assessments of the potential for mass atrocity crimes, but also to coordinate responses to crises occurring elsewhere. Because as we've learned, as the principle has become to be implemented, there are a variety of mechanisms you might use that don't all reside, for example, within the Department of Foreign Affairs. They might, in fact, interestingly, the US approach to this, the Treasury is a very important entity because of the use of financial sanctions in trying to deter perpetrators. So when you recognize that sometimes the phrase whole of government approach is used here, the national focal points are a way of trying to mobilize multiple departments in government.
Very good. We'll be back again in a minute with Jennifer Welch. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. One more question about concepts before we turn to the actual nuts and bolts of implementation. It's not been a long time since the term has been around, but has the concept evolved in any interesting way in the abstract? Do we think about it differently now in general than we did at the outset? Or is it more or less the same?
I think the concept has evolved. It's definitely evolved in terms of thinking of it as having three pillars, which includes a very important preventive component. While that element of it was emphasized in 2001, the report of the ICISS was really designed to address Kosovo and Rwanda-like dilemmas around the use of force. And so I think the concept evolved in that we recognize now that it is much more multidimensional, although there's a continual effort that needs to be made to emphasize that the principle is not all about military intervention, which is the common perception, for good reason. There is a concern that that's what it's ultimately all about.
Yeah. And it was never originally intended to be a military thing. Ideally, you would have the principle and you'd implement it without actually having to use force. In the best of all possible worlds.
Absolutely.
So, which raises the question of how can you tell when it's been implemented? So we know when there's military intervention to prevent gross human rights violations, but we don't necessarily obviously see where other things are being done. How often has it been implemented, and what are some good cases of non-military implementation of R2P?
Well, I think it's an interesting question about how do we know if it's been implemented, because I think there's a difference between it being invoked and it being implemented, and I'm glad you asked that question. It's actually been invoked in a number of cases, even by the Security Council, there's a focus on the Libya invocation of responsibility to protect, but actually the Council has used it to refer to other cases in Yemen, in South Sudan, in Cote d'Ivoire. So there's been a variety of cases. But with respect to non-military means, I think a very interesting example is Kenya from 2007 and 2008, where I think the responsibility to protect principle didn't prevent atrocities in the deepest sense, because the international community reacted, some would say, very late. All the signs were there that violence was going to break out after the elections, and it wasn't prevented in the first instance. But the principle certainly helped, and the tools associated with it, to prevent escalation, to stop the number of deaths. There were roughly 1,200 deaths, but a real concern about a spiral into ethnic violence. And so the principle helped to coordinate an effort that involved first and foremost mediation, which was led by Kofi Annan, but also a series of other tools, including sanctions, and very concerted pressure on particular individuals who it was believed had control over the violence. And all of this was done without military intervention. So it showed how if there is a commitment to protect populations, even at a late stage, different tools can be used. The lesson from that case is how important coordination is, which we don't always have. That you had not only a African Union sponsored peace process, but you also had governments bilaterally interacting in ways with Kenyan authorities on both sides of the disputed election. So it's an extremely interesting case for showing the multifaceted ways in which this can be done.
So you would call that a success, even if it was a little bit late?
I would call it a qualified success.
Qualified success.
It stopped the killing.
Right.
There's been lots of questions about the nature of the agreement that stopped that killing, and whether, despite there being elements of that agreement that were meant to address so-called root causes and deeper grievances, the work on that part of the agenda has been slower. But I don't think that was necessarily the fault of the mediation. We might say it was more the fault of the implementation of the mediation.
Are there cases where it was invoked but not implemented in any meaningful way?
I think it was invoked controversially in a couple of instances. One was in the context of Cyclone Nargis, where some declared that the government in Myanmar's failure to allow humanitarian assistance effectively breached the principle. That led to a debate over whether a situation like this constitutes a breach of the responsibility to protect. So it really wasn't acted on in that particular instance, although humanitarian assistance is one element of the responsibility to protect, and work was done to try to get assistance in. But the more dramatic means that I think some wanted to see didn't happen.
And what are some of the textbook failures in your view, where it was tried and didn't work, or really should have been tried and obviously wasn't implemented?
Well, I think the way to think about failures is why were certain means not used. So if I look at the case of Syria, which is before us, my assessment of that case would be that the principle has been invoked and that it has been acted on in a number of ways. So states, particularly in the neighborhood of Syria, have most certainly fulfilled their responsibility to protect by accepting refugees. States bilaterally and multilaterally imposed sanctions, not through the UN, unfortunately, but through regional organizations. There have been attempts to put pressure on the parties, but the one entity which has a responsibility to use coercive measures under the third pillar, the Security Council, failed to do so, failed to come to agreement. Both to impose tougher sanctions, particularly an arms embargo, but also to place behind its statements the threat of more coercion, to try to bring parties to the table. So I think there we can say that the Security Council failed to exercise its responsibility to protect in terms of the tools it has at its disposal. And I think that's how we need to think about failure, is which tools were failed to be be leaned on, as opposed to the failure of the concept itself. Because like all norms, the responsibility to protect can only set up permissible kinds of actions that might take place. It can't force those things to occur. It can catalyze, it can, through past experience, demonstrate how tools might be used. But as a principle, it can do no more than that. I personally believe that's still very powerful because, principles in the history of international relations have served very powerfully to catalyze action, and I think that's what the principle will do going forward.
Right, and it takes time for them to become strong norms.
Absolutely, and to be seen as being appropriate.
Yeah.
I mean, even in Syria, and I don't dispute the horrific nature of what we see and the moral dilemmas there, it is remarkably different from 2 decades ago, where in the Balkans you could have acts occurring where the international community would debate whether this was a legitimate matter of international concern.
Right. That is a major change.
We do not debate that now.
Yeah.
And very early on, even in July of 2011, entities were calling the events in Syria crimes against humanity. And UN bodies like the Human Rights Council were playing a very important role in monitoring, investigating, and essentially labeling what was going on. And those labels then have to be picked up by decision makers who will, for better or for worse, act inconsistently sometimes.
Very good. We'll be back again in a moment with Jennifer Welsh. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So as you know, there's been a lot of commentary in the news about the contrast between what's happening in Syria and what happened in Libya just a few years ago. And a lot of the spin that contrast gets is that Libya was a major step forward for R2P. We can call it a clear success in a sense. The international community really did act strongly in the face of a very significant violation of civilians' rights there, but we don't see that in Syria, and so either something is broken or we've backslid or something like that. R2P is now in trouble. What is your interpretation of that debate? Do you think that's wrong-headed? Do you think we're focusing on the wrong dimensions of the difference? And in particular, why did we see robust international response to Libya, but we haven't seen the same?
Let me start with that question first, and then I think a number of things came together in Libya that did not come together in the same way in Syria. I think first and foremost, you had a strong domestic set of factors in a couple of states, most notably France, in terms of wanting to lead an effort to respond to what was an imminent atrocity, a kind of single event. And I think the second factor is exactly that Gaddafi's rhetoric, his threat to attack the cockroaches in Benghazi, used language, set up a potential event that galvanized action. And actors at the time had to make a probabilistic assessment. If we don't act, what is going to happen? And so the decision was around that. It was kind of a single decision. Added to that, you had very concerted action by the Arab League, which made it possible for an organization like NATO to say that it was willing to contemplate leading the use of force. And most importantly, you had Security Council authorization. You had agreement in the Council, although you had abstentions, not necessarily votes in favor. You had 5 significant abstentions. Now, I think one aspect of the Libyan intervention did affect the responsibility to protect going forward, although I do think it's slightly wrong-headed to say that because of what happened in Libya, we haven't seen action in Syria. And I'll come to in a moment why I think the Syrian context is different. But one thing that did happen in Libya, which created issues for the principle, was that a number of countries on the Security Council in particular viewed NATO's action as having gone beyond the mandate. So this crucial legitimacy of the Council was achieved, and the Council authorized NATO and its coalition to use force. But the perception was that that was essentially, from that point on, an unaccountable exercise, that there was no coming back to the Council, there was no monitoring of how the campaign was carried out, and many at the time and afterwards said we did not support going as far as regime change. And so I think that did hurt the principle in that it raised questions about if force is authorized, how do we ensure that those who use force on behalf of the Council will be accountable. I personally think that opened up an important and constructive debate, because that will be part of the evolution of the principle. And indeed, the Brazilian government, very constructively after Libya, put forward an initiative called Responsibility While Protecting in 2011. Very significant that Brazil did this, an emerging power, precisely to deal with this problem of the accountability of those who use force on the Council's behalf. So I think that did raise concerns. It raised concerns about how entities would interpret Council resolutions. And so there was a fear, even to impose sanctions on Syria for fear of how resolutions might be bended, interpreted. With respect to Syria, I think the situation is different from a variety of perspectives. First and foremost, it isn't a single atrocity we're trying to prevent. It's now a raging civil conflict with very complex dynamics. Right. The degree of outside interest in the trajectory of the conflict is huge, from countries like Iran and Russia, which make it very difficult to exert influence in a coordinated way on the actors, but also difficult to get a consensus. And I think also there's been ambivalence from Western powers, rather than domestic pressure, or a sense that decision makers would gain domestically. There's been precisely the opposite, a belief that if we use force, it will be in many ways against what public opinion is telling us. And that has been so significant, the evolution in public opinion about the use of force, any use of force. I hasten to add, this isn't a problem for responsibility to protect alone. It's a problem for any use of force that is not a peacekeeping mission. Right. That we now have a real reluctance in Western publics to agree to action like that.
Right. And add to that, there was a feasibility difference. It was not hard for NATO to do what it wanted to do in Libya, but it's very hard to imagine the military operation that solves the problem in Syria.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a very confined exercise. It was also easy to say, I think this is important, relatively easy to say in the Security Council, this is what the campaign will look like. We're going to do these things, we're going to take out these air defense forces. Whereas to paint a picture of what military action would look like right now in Syria, there would be a lot of ifs. There would be a lot of debate. Yeah.
Very good. We'll be back one more time with Jennifer Welsh. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issue, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. So, crystal ball time. How do you think it will evolve? Will the doctrine evolve conceptually? Will we see more implementation? Are we likely to see different kinds of implementation, fine-tuning, tweaking? And if someone asked you, how you would advise the international community on the future direction of this principle, what would you say?
I think the responsibility to protect needs to be embedded much more centrally into what the United Nations and regional organizations do and in what states do.
The way it has been in the AU Charter, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, but also in terms of real-time activities. So for example, I see in the future the responsibility to protect aligning much more closely with some of the human rights architecture within the United Nations system. So because the principle involves prevention, how is it that human rights violations, physical integrity violations might raise alarm bells about the potential for mass atrocity crimes? We have existing machinery within the UN system that already monitors and reacts to such things. I can see the responsibility to protect principle being aligned over time more with those kinds of exercises. Also with the civilian protection mandates that are now part of peacekeeping missions. I do think the principle will continue to hold a lot of power for civil society and individuals. Despite some of the opposition and concern, it's been picked up as a phrase, as language, as a moral notion that I think there is no turning back from. So I can see it being invoked in a number of situations for a variety of actors calling on decision makers to fulfill the responsibility to protect. I don't think that will go away, but in a very concrete sense, I think it needs to become part of the way that governments and organizations do business. And I think it will be. over time, because a lot of the tools associated with it are tools we use for other things. We use sanctions, for example, in other ways.
Right.
We use mediation. We use fact-finding missions all the time. So the question becomes, how do we want to use these tools to advance the agenda of mass atrocity prevention? And how even do we want to get smarter about the kinds of things we do further back in the temporal chain to try to promote interfaith dialogue, to try to promote civic education, to try to promote strong human rights institutions? Those things are also part of laying the foundation for societies that will protect their populations. So it really is a kind of embedding phase, I think, we're going to be seeing next.
And would you like to see it remain more or less a political principle that takes place as managed in the political realm, or would you like to see it become more closely integrated with the International Criminal Court and the gradual legalization of human rights norms? Does it help or hurt if the International Criminal Court is more closely associated with R2P?
I don't think it hurts. I think the two agendas are aligned in some important ways, but the responsibility to protect is a political principle.
Right.
What it does is draw on existing law. But certainly the entire agenda of international criminal justice is important to the principle. The notion of accountability as a form of prevention, I think, is intimately related with the responsibility to protect agenda. So I don't see the association as hurting. I think we need to be very careful, though, about how they work together. So, for example, if the Security Council is going to refer situations to the International Criminal Court, very difficult situations like Libya, like Syria, ongoing conflicts, we need to think about how those steps affect the International Criminal Court, because not all the effects are positive. Both the International Criminal Court and responsibility to protect are fragile, new ideas. And we need to ensure that they support each other rather than undermine each other. But I don't see, at a conceptual level, a tension. I see more in how we go about doing it.
Yeah, the argument was, I guess, it's not clear in advance whether, for example, the threat of international criminal prosecution in the background is more likely to deter bad behavior on the part of authoritarian regimes, or convince them that they must do all the more to hang on to power because they'll suffer if they lose. I remember that debate came up in Libya.
Absolutely.
And presumably it's also been discussed in the background with respect to Syria, but it's interestingly not been very prominent in the news coverage.
And there you get into debates about how do we most effectively protect populations. If you believe that the solution is to end conflict at all costs, then it may be that you view there to be a fundamental tension with accountability mechanisms. But I think it will differ from case to case. We also need to remember that not all mass atrocities are committed in the context of armed conflict.
Right.
That is why the responsibility to protect principle is so valuable, is that it spans both conflict situations and non-conflict situations. And so there, I think, the International Criminal Court's association with responsibility to protect is maybe a little bit more straightforward.
And how about Canada's role? Do we have a prominent role to play in the future? We claim invention here to some extent, and we were, of course, an early champion of the concept of human security. We're not particularly anymore. Is there something that Canada in particular is well positioned to do to promote the kind of embeddedness you'd like to see?
I think Canada's role is important in terms of Pillar 1, in terms of demonstrating how countries can take steps to protect their own populations through attempts to manage diversity within their societies and to essentially share the learnings of what we have done. And I'd like to see Canada do more of that. But I think in the Pillar 2 agenda of assisting states, the responsibility to protect is very consistent with some of the priorities that Canada's had in its foreign policy about building, for example, the rule of law internationally. So it can continue to take a leading role there. And it has participated, although, as you say, with perhaps less muscle than some others, in the more coercive dimensions of the responsibility to protect. It was active in Libya.
Very much so.
So I'd like to see it continue to play a role. There is a group of friends on the responsibility to protect, which Canada has been a member of, an active member of in the past. And that remains, I think, an important forum for thinking through, at least within the UN, how the principle can be implemented.
Very good. Well, thanks for coming in and helping us understand this complicated innovation a lot better.
Thank you.
Appreciate your time and your insights. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. And join us again next week, please, for another episode of Inside the Issues, the CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Being applied. So for the benefit of the audience that may not know the deep backstory to what we sometimes call R2P, responsibility to protect, maybe you can say a little bit about where it came from and why it's there and what its main effect was intended to be.
Well, the principle really arose out of the failures of the international community to respond to very conscience shocking situations like those we saw in Rwanda, Srebrenica, and more recently the kinds of events we see in Syria. And the idea that while sovereign states are a building block of the international system.
CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsley School of International Affairs and Senior Fellow here at CG, and every week it's our pleasure to welcome a guest into the studio at the Center for International Governance Innovation to talk about some hot topic on the international agenda. And today I'm very pleased to be welcoming Jennifer Welsh, who's a professor in international relations at the University of Oxford and a fellow at Somerville College as well, and welcome. Also, a practitioner of sorts. You've actually done work with the United Nations on the responsibility to protect, among other things. So you'll help us understand the principle and how it is or is not. Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Jennifer Welsh on implementing the responsibility to protect. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. I'm David Welch.
By Kofi Annan in his plans for the 2005 World Summit of the United Nations, and their states unanimously endorsed two clauses which enshrine the responsibility to protect, which is really a political commitment of states to protect their populations from four acts: crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and war crimes.
Now, the responsibility in the first instance is the responsibility of the government of the state concerned.
The state holds the primary responsibility, and there the principle really just reminds states of the existing obligations they have. We need to be able to act to support states to protect their populations, or indeed, if they cannot protect their populations, to find a way to do so through the international community. So actually Canada was very instrumental in the development of the principle. In 2001, there was a commission, the International Commission on Intervention in State Sovereignty, which issued a report called The Responsibility to Protect. And that principle really helped to change the way we think about these kinds of crises and to focus the attention on those who need protecting. The principle from there was adopted